Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's fall webinar event sponsored by the Making Our Strong Community Stronger Collaborative. Today's webinar is titled Words Matter, the Language of Diversity, Understanding, and Acceptance. My name is Mari Adamson-Bray. I'm the Publishing Director of Tech Channel and MSPC. And we're so very proud to be an integral part of this brilliant and dynamic mainframe industry. Tech Channel, who, along with sponsoring members BMC, Broadcom Mainframe Software, IBM, the Open Mainframe Project, Rocket Software, and Virtual Z Computing, make today's event possible. Thank you to them. As participants are still logging in, I'd like to cover off just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared on our Making Our Strong Community Stronger LinkedIn page for your on-demand viewing. Please feel free to invite and share with your colleagues and your friends. You will be muted for the duration of the panel discussion. However, we do encourage engagement. So add your questions or your comments to the chat for our Q&A at the end of the discussion. You will also be unmuted at the end. So if you wish to ask a question or contribute to the discussion, you can at that time. With housekeeping complete, I'd like to welcome back our past attendees. And for those of you who are new here today, thanks for joining. We have a great event planned for you here. The Making Our Strong Community Stronger Collaborative continues to gain momentum in the mainframe industry, where we bring the community together through our webinar programming, our conversations, our receptions at industry events, and through elevating our voice and our initiatives in partner, media, and social channels. We believe these honest conversations are raising awareness around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And in some way, they're calling us all to take action and to make an impact. We need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And our work here will continue, as we hope yours will as well. So back to today's webinar, Words Matter. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Gloria Chance, who has led many of our past popular webinars. Dr. Chance is the CEO and innovative leader of the Musai Group, an executive advisory and leadership development firm dedicated to creating executive advice and experience that awakens, sparks growth, transformation, and peak performance. She's an award-winning keynote speaker, specifically in tech and banking, among others. She's an award-winning talk show host, an author, and the list just goes on. Thanks to her and to our amazing panelists, who you will meet in a moment, for their careful preparation, their stories, and their commitment to our event today. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our sponsors. And with that, Dr. Chance, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you for that introduction. My goodness, your voice is so calm and soothing. And welcome everyone to the Words Matter discussion. As Mari mentioned, I'm Dr. Gloria Chance, and I'm thrilled to be back with you today. So as we get started, I want to give you a couple of kind of tidbits of data that I think I want you to carry with you, because this topic isn't just about being a better human being and being diverse. It's also about, as a better leader, how are you going to make these things become true for your organization? Because we will be challenged in the future as competition increases and people kind of get the understanding of these key points I'm getting ready to make. And this is based on industry research. So quickly, 19% of the companies who are more diverse have said that they get 19% more revenue. 27% of the companies are more likely to have superior value creation when they are more gender diverse on their boards. 87% of the companies make better decisions when they have diverse teams. Inclusive companies are 1.7 times more innovative. Companies that have highly inclusive cultures have 2.3 times more cash flow per employee. 120% of the companies, or I'm sorry, companies who are more inclusive create more than 120% of their financial goals. In other words, they hit their financial goals 120% of the time. And finally, diverse teams are 70% more likely to capture new markets. And you wonder why, because when you're capturing new markets, what are you doing? You're leveraging the sort of expansiveness of different types of people. So diversity is not only about becoming complete and better human beings, all of us. It's about learning from each other, honoring each other, and coming to the table with dignity in a way that will not just make you better, but whatever project you're working on, whatever company or whatever goal that you have. So as we talk about words matter, affirmative language is what we all know benefits us, it motivates us. For example, if you tell me, if you're speaking to me nicely and kindly, I will likely want to help you succeed because I also see the benefit. As opposed to negative words, which we know in history have, the negative words have caused not only death, but world wars. But what we're here to talk about today is not that extreme. We're looking at how words can build the bedrock of new levels of progress, appreciation, and humanity. So I want to ask you a question. If you doubt the power of words, ask yourself this. Have you tiptoed around about how to address a person or a group of people for fear of saying the wrong thing or for offending them? I have. Everybody has. So the question as we go through this is I want you to check your cultural sensitivity. In other words, are you aware of how you feel? And are you aware of maybe what you're saying and how it might impact others? So as a psychologist, my main goal in these conversations is to always expand the way that we all think creatively so that we can improve our performance while increasing human potential. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And on behalf of our sponsors, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our esteemed panelists. Now they're coming here telling their stories around this topic. And so again, their bravery and being honest and open about their experiences is something to be admired. So no judgment, because unless you raise your hand to sit on the stage. So I also want to acknowledge Nick Harris, who you have seen on our marketing information, unfortunately cannot be with us today due to a death in her family. So we want to send out best wishes to the Harris family. So let's get started. I'd like to welcome our panelists, Alicia, Jane, Shahed, and Michael, joining the conversation with us today. And so as we begin, I want to get the panelists to introduce themselves, their name and their title, and then to answer this question as we begin, why do words matter to you? So let's start with you, Jane.
Thanks, Dr. Chance. My name is Jane Kezhentsova. I am a Customer Solutions Delivery Manager at Rocket Software. And my personal experience with words has been that as the new words getting introduced to the language, English language, this process helped me with a personal struggle that I had since the day I was born, basically. As you know, when a child is born in most of the places on Earth, we all get assigned a particular gender, and most of the times one of the two. And what it means in reality is that you get assigned a specific label, and throughout your life, you expected to live in a very specific way according to that label. And if you think about it, this is kind of ridiculous, especially now that we know that so many people don't really fit into these buckets, and they never did, but now it's becoming more and more clear to everyone that men and women are not the only options that there are for us. And since we have introduced words like non-binary and non-conforming, asexual, pansexual, and so many other ones, the life of so many people, including myself, has become so much easier. And that's because words have power to shape our minds. And that's something very important to me personally, and I think for all of us.
Of course, I love that, Jane. Thank you. Words shaping our minds. I do just want to say that words, remember inside of us, we have words that get repeated in our minds. So it's important to check your words because they do actually impact your behavior. Thank you for that, Jane. Alicia.
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Gloria, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Alicia M. Campbell, and I'm the founder and CEO of Culture Shift HR. And words matter because, as everyone was just sharing just now, they impact your thoughts, they impact your perception of the world, the perception of yourself. And we don't realize that through repeated negativity or through repeated words that can cause constraint and limitations, you then begin to put those limitations on yourself. And so when I think about my experience and my intersection with words, so many times very early on in my career, I got very negative connotations with, no, you can't do this, or, questions on why, and, are you even qualified to do what you do? And not realizing that those then became my thoughts and really affected the way that I show up and really were present around my colleagues, around my peers, and really how I saw myself in the world. And it took a lot of self-work and development to realize that I am so much more than the words people or labels put on me, but I'm what I decide that I am. And not everyone finds that inner strength. And so I just encourage everyone as we go through this time together to recognize the power of words and to be mindful of the positive intent we need to have when using words.
Thank you, Alicia. Very powerful about, words actually get, especially people who are marginalized, it gives you, unfortunately, a sense of who you are if you hear negative words all of the time. Thank you for that, Shahed.
Hello, my name is Shahad Al-Ghadi. I'm a project manager at BMC Software, and words matter to me because I feel that with the relatively recent advent of social media and high-speed internet, we are now more interconnected than ever. And there is now a platform for people who historically have never had one. And I feel that we really do have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to set the precedent for future generations for what language is acceptable and how we should interact with one another and really just define the sphere of civility on a global scale.
Thank you, for sure. Very, very powerful. Yeah, now words are flying by us so quickly, right? How do you even keep up with them? For sure. And finally, but not least, Michael.
Not least, I hope. But I appreciate everybody else's thoughts and comments here. Every time we go through this stuff, I learn. So Michael Daubman, I'm the director of product management in Mainframe Software. So I really believe in general that we could probably be doing a better job in using words to gain insights as we're talking to people, maybe without it becoming patronizing, right? Especially for me as a white man. So as a leader, I believe very strongly in diversity, equity, and inclusion is as a primary responsibility to be an effective leader. And I can talk more about that. But I have this responsibility to stay educated and observant. I think it's really easy to push the responsibility for the people you're talking to react to your words or educate you. And my thought is that's not fair, right? It doesn't feel like an equal power dynamic in the conversation and to put the expectation of education on the person that I'm talking to. So I work really hard to keep a level of empathy and thoughtfulness in my head as much as I can at all times, to be sensitive to the words I'm using in my normal conversation, and what I can do as a leader to set direction with the rest of my team. So I find if I remain alert and own my uncomfortableness in conversations, that I can learn, evolve, and grow. And so what I've learned over time is just being open, honest, and transparent as best I can tends to be received well. Even if I'm uncomfortable, it generally turns out all right.
So I love, Michael, that you talked about learning, evolving, and growing. So if you have that in your mind, we get closer to cultural sensitivity, which is really understanding, again, what you're feeling, but knowing, especially if you're in a position of power. And I want to say that power isn't just about being a white man. It can be your position over someone, your position in a company, your title. All of those things give you privilege and power. But let's talk about cultural sensitivity. And cultural sensitivity is being aware that cultural differences and similarities exist. That's really it. Like, just know that, okay, I'm talking to someone who might be different than me. Sometimes a person can look like you and be significantly different from you. So you want to look at people without assigning a value, positive or negative, better or worse, right or wrong. So I want to know from the panelists, where have you experienced insensitivity and what words played a part in that? Let's start with Shahed and then Michael.
So as a Muslim American, my community is very tight knit, and it is the norm to support one another. It's the norm to help each other professionally, academically, culturally. So one term that I find is like often driven by Western media or Western culture is bootstrap. I find this to be a really insensitive term because it's this narrative that pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Nobody helped me. And not only is it extremely divisive, it's rooted on a false narrative that we exist in a meritocracy, that we exist in a society where if you work hard, you will be rewarded, and that your efforts and your accomplishments are directly related. And absolutely, that's not true. We know that that's not true. And I just find it very insensitive when that narrative is continually peddled. And sometimes it kind of seeps its way into communities of color, and successful people of color begin to say that to one another. And it's like, by a stroke of luck, you made it out, and now you're almost closing the door behind you. So that's a term that really just drives me up the wall.
Great. And Shahed, that's a really important point about bootstraps, because I think you make a point about, even when you were in school, just the fact that people had different experiences and opportunities in school that you didn't have before either. Is that correct? That, caused you to feel like, wait, I've done. And I think Alicia references, I've worked around the clock and I've done all these things, and yet I'm still getting negative feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a lower income community, and I went to public school, and I was always top of my class. I was always fine. And when I graduated, I got a scholarship for college. And I remember, like, in many of my classes, I would be sitting there, like in calculus. Like, this happened to me. I was in calculus, and the professor had explained something, and then we had like a pop quiz over what she had just explained. And I was just at a loss. I looked down. I did not know what was going on. I had never seen this stuff. And my friends next to me were like, had done it and were texting on their phones. And I looked over and I was like, hey, how do you know how to do this? And they were like, oh, I learned this in high school. And I was like, what are you talking about? And they're like, oh yeah, I was offered this in high school. And I was like, what else were you offered in high school? They're like, oh, we had like computer science classes, we had coding classes, we had like MacBooks, we had laptops. And then I felt like so small and so stupid. I genuinely felt like, wow, I will never, no matter how hard I work, I just feel like my foundation is off and I will never be able to accomplish what my peers are. They're already so ahead of me. And I had never felt that way before. And it's just because I had been in a different zip code.
That's very, very, thank you for that. That's very profound. So let's go ahead, Michael, let's share your experience about your thoughts about being culturally insensitive.
Yeah, sure. So, I've been a leader, at least in some capacity, for about 20 years in technology. And I think just the working with teams and maturing over that time, it's probably the last 10 years that sort of a light bulb went off. And I think hearing some of the words before me talking is interesting, because I think it's very easy for me to bring my bias to the words I'm using. I think it's easy for us to say, get into this trap of, hey, we all have challenges to deal with. And that means I can sort of just, talk and use these words, and it's okay for me to have opportunity. And that's true to an extent, but I think it's important. And sort of that light bulb moment was me being able to recognize and articulate my privilege and where maybe others can struggle. So the words we use in work and day-to-day life can be interpreted by those experiences, by other people's struggles, by where they came from. So and it's interesting, there's a good couple examples I have, but I've had similar discussions with my son around privilege and what it means to be privileged. And maybe not an experience that puts me in the best light, but recently pulled over. Electric cars are fast, that's all I'll say. And the discussion my son and I had after that was that, besides being worried about getting a ticket, him and I had no other fears, right? I wasn't worried how what I was wearing was going to influence if the cop believed I was maybe potentially criminal. I wasn't worried about that I had to keep my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel at all times. I had no fears. And when we were talking about privilege with my son, I shared stories that people have shared with me, people on my team, people on other teams, that is a very different experience for different people of all types, right? And sort of maybe to segue a little bit closer to the school example that Shahed gave, my son also was recently, and he's in a high school now, where we're looking at high schools, and the school has a principal that says, we're going to try to get 70% of our applicants accepted who are from a first generation college parent. So parent who's never gone to college. They have parents that go to college. And the initial reaction is, well, that's just not fair. I work really hard. I should be able to go to this. It's a technological school. So the discussion we had in recognizing our privilege was, yeah, and really good example before, but you have privilege, as he's 13 years old. You have a school that maybe isn't a different zip code. You have my ability to afford private tutoring. We send you to technology camps in the summer. You're coming with a resume into this college that other people don't have. And so it's okay. As a matter of fact, it is great that there's other ways to give privilege where people haven't had it in little ways. Does it balance all this out? No, but I think it's so it's interesting as I had that discussion with him.
It is, Michael, and thank you for that, because what you're also saying, and I hope people will relate to this, is that our children are a part of this also. How you show up at work, how you show up in any way does impact the future generation. So this is very deep and important conversations that that string of who you are will perpetuate throughout your lifetime. And so it's really important to understand on this topic who you are. And thank you. I want to acknowledge Kenneth's comment about the bootstrap point. And he says that even when team members work on the same task using the same tools, there is always something to learn from each other, no matter the gap in skills or experience up or down. And so I think, Shahed, the point you made, and Michael, is for leaders. Yeah, people may have different learning styles and different ways of learning. They may have trauma related to, as Alicia says, words that were said to them. But your job as a team lead is to honor that and to understand more about what the needs are of the team. Because I think we all want to get those outcomes I mentioned earlier, right? We want to have the higher percentage performance if we're working with a company. So thank you for that comment, Kenneth. So let's move on, Michael. I'm not going to ask this question. I would just want to acknowledge that Michael spoke to privilege, and particularly working with his young son to better teach cultural sensitivity. So he gave a great example of how you can teach cultural sensitivity. So thank you for doing that, Michael. It implies that you were paying attention when people of color were saying to you what happens to them, or listening to the news, what happens to particularly Black American males when they get stopped by the police. These are all things that we have to put in context for our families and even for ourselves. So privilege is about recognizing the power that one holds. And thank you for modeling that, Michael. And in case we're not clear, because we use the word privilege a lot in this space. So I want to give you the definition. Privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. So that's why the word privilege is so important to understand. And I want to ask the panel, what does privilege feel like from your perspective? So I want to start with Alicia and then Jane and Shahed, because we've heard Michael's point of view. Let's hear yours in terms of how privilege falls on you.
Yes, that's a really great question. My experience with privilege, unfortunately, has growing up, in the workplace, in a very white, male-dominated tech environment, it really put a shadow on me and what I was able to bring to the table. So many times, because of the privilege that other individuals have had, whether it was through their schooling, other experiences, their own resumes, I continually felt like I just wasn't enough. And so when you take that, plus the words that were being used, I was constantly always behind, even if I wasn't, just from a mindset perspective, and having to always constantly prove myself over and over and over again. Whereas my counterparts would say something and it was taken word for word. And so having to justify my actions, having to justify my work, having to work twice as hard to get half as far was something that was very, very real for me. And it actually led me to a point where I was so encapsulated with work that really there was no separation between who Alicia was and my work experiences. I would sleep with my laptop beside my desk or beside my night table. My hours of work were from 4 a.m. to 2 a.m. Because I constantly felt that I needed to be that first one to respond to email, the first one to be on something, to show that I was that driven worker that got things done, that put in the work, that burned the midnight oil, and not realizing that I was losing myself in the process. Within 6 months, I burnt out. I was exhausted. I really didn't recognize who I was anymore. My mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health were down the drain. And I was really a shattered individual that really had to then build herself back up. And when I think about those moments and I think about the privilege that my team had at the time, was that nobody stopped me. No one had pulled me aside to say, hey, Alicia, like, I see you're sending some late night emails, are you okay? How are you balancing life and work? How can we help you? How can we, make things a little bit more accessible to you? It was just on me. And because I wasn't getting a different narrative, it continued to drive home the point that this was what I had to do. And so given all those different factors, it led to me burning out and really even now not even performing as well as I could have, because there were so many other strains and stressors and expectations put on me. Plus, with all that continually being questioned about the work that I did, why my approach was the way it was, even if my work was better or beyond what my colleagues or my coworkers did. And so that privilege of not having to be questioned, that privilege of not having to be second guessed or to be questioned and asked why over and over and over again till your words don't even make sense in and of itself, really is something that we don't recognize. And that to have to continually prove yourself is an exhausting experience, having to constantly do work 2-3 times to not only yourself but to your peers or to your leaders, really gets you in this place of self-doubt that unfortunately many people can't or don't always see themselves come out of. And so I just say that understanding the privilege you have, use that for good. Understand how you can lean in and support others, lean in how you can see the opportunities that other backgrounds and experiences can bring to your team and to the work, because that's where that innovation and that opportunity to create real change really exists.
So Alicia, I have to say I'm exhausted just hearing your experience with privilege. Even though I have gone through it myself personally, you're bringing back memories that I don't want to remember. And I think that's the key point, is her privilege for someone like Alicia falls differently and lands differently on someone like Michael. And it's not to pick on Michael, because Michael was born the way he was born, just as all of us were. And I think that is the point. And someone has in the Q&A how to best deal with when someone's first language isn't English and they aren't aware of which words matter. Jane can actually, in your response, I don't know if it's in this segment, but speak to privilege. And I think you do talk about words in terms of basic words that people don't get. And as a Russian American, how you deal with that. So let's talk about privilege, and if you get a chance to weave that in.
Sure. I think privilege comes often with the assumption that what you have is the default and everyone has it, and failing to see that not everyone has the same experience. It comes in drastic forms, like Alicia just explained, but also in small things that together combined can do harm to people and organizations. So a few examples for this, and you mentioned language. That's and not being a native English speaker, that's the experience I recently had was, and you often hear it in global corporate environments that are dominated by men who are born and raised US Americans. You would often hear some American football or baseball analogies. So you would hear people say, well, this group or this person, they're like a quarterback. And if I hear it, I'm a Russian immigrant. I'm actually based out of the Netherlands. This metaphor, it doesn't do anything to me. And, if anything, it confuses me, or worse, it just makes me feel excluded. Like the person who chose to make this analogy they just didn't consider that knowing the rules of American football, the roles of the player, is just not something that is default in their audience. And you don't need to be from another country to have this experience. In the US, not everyone knows and understands American football, and not all those people are women either. So considering who you're talking to and that they might not have the same experience as you is very important, because then what you want to convey actually lands with those people and you are being effective in your communication. So in this case, it just backfired at the person who said it. But it's not because they're a bad person, it's because they just didn't think about it or didn't know. And then some other things or some other examples can be, well, I think something everyone heard about is the thing with the word guys that we use to address a mixed group of people. So sometimes people, it's very easy, people say to a group of, even group of ladies, group of women, they can say guys. And you know, people often tell me, well, that's okay, language has changed, now it means everyone. And I totally get that, it's a valid point, language does change and it's great. And though I don't hear guys saying I'm into guys when they want to say I'm into ladies or I prefer ladies. So, you know, in this case, guys doesn't mean everyone, guys mean a very specific thing. So while the language does change, some of those things don't change as fast, or actually might can backfire when we don't think about what they mean and how we use them. Addressing group of people whose backgrounds we don't really know.
Exactly. And so Jane, and so when you talk about gender identity, when we talk about guys and ladies, how does that impact you?
Sure, it's a good point, because you might say, okay, why are you on to guys? But I would like to offer an idea that all gendered ways to address a group of people might be, you know, obsolete. I have recently received like an email from a colleague. It was addressed to a group of women, and it started with "Hey, ladies," and it really felt like it doesn't apply to me. I'm a non-binary person. I generally don't identify as a woman, and I definitely don't feel like a lady. So that made me feel like not very enthusiastic about, you know, responding. But again, I do know that this colleague didn't mean any harm, and of course, it's a learning curve for everyone. So no harm done, but it's just an illustration of how these assumptions and the privilege, unless it's explored and reflected upon, can really mislead us and be harmful.
And thank you for that, Jane. And the point around this privilege is that when you're privileged, you tend to take learning as not so important, because it's like a status quo. This is how we do it, and you hang on to that. But as things are changing and evolving, it may seem hard to like, oh my God, now I can't call you lady, I can't call you guys. What should I do? But the key point in this is that as you hear Jane, Alicia, Shahed talk about their experiences as being sort of more in the marginalized group, they have to learn every day. They have to learn how corporate works, how America works, how men work, and it's on and on learning. So I think the ask is, can those who haven't had to learn every day start? Can you start understanding? So if we don't use ladies and guys, can you say good morning, everyone? There are some simple interchanges that you can make if you just pause and think. So finally, on this topic, what does privilege look like from your perspective, Shahed?
First of all, the term privilege has just absolutely skyrocketed in popularity over the last 2 years when we all got quarantined, had to sit at home and look at ourselves and reflect. And I feel like we've gotten to a point where check your privilege is a very common phrase across all cultures, and everyone claims to check their privilege. But I don't find that to be true, because if we were all checking our privilege, we'd be in a completely different reality than 2 years ago, and we're not. So I really implore someone, when they are checking their privilege, not to just take stock of all of like the perks that they had based off of their situation, but to also consider all of the things that someone above you might have. I feel like when we're checking our privilege and we're just focusing on all of the perks that we have, it invokes a natural response of like guilt or shame or fear that, oh, someone's gonna come and take something from me. And that's not true. There's always a bigger fish, and we should stop and consider how we would feel if somebody with more privilege than us took that privilege and wielded the power that they have over us in order, like against us essentially, and made no efforts to level the playing field. And I feel like switching that perspective will help us kind of empathize with one another and not make things so divisive. I also feel like for me, privilege, it really comes into play along racial lines, like in the West specifically, and really in the Arab world as well. White supremacy exists in a tiered. And obviously at the top, the dominant group, which like in our society happens to be white men, they tend to be at the top of the pyramid, but there are tiers below that. And your proximity to the dominant group gives you a lot of privilege. And at the very bottom of the pyramid are Black women, and above them are women of color, and above them are men of color. And it's important to consider how privilege is multiplied in different ways across where you are and your identity. It's not just a one size fits all. This is, some are privileged, some aren't. There's so much nuance to the conversation.
Thank you for that, Shahid. So Shahid references in her comments this concept of power and proximity to power. And I think that is so important to understand. And you mentioned white men, you didn't mention white women. And I think there's an opportunity as we look at adjacency to power that we understand that, and understand that when we're adjacent to power, we can speak one word to that person that has privilege and power and can impact all of those people below us. Mm-hmm. So I think that it is really, that's a powerful statement. And as we're talking about power, Alicia, speaking of that, you know, the word woke is a word that has become also one of these things that we hear a lot about. And recently, though, it was sort of redefined, and it was made by those in power who have a louder megaphone. It's been turned into something negative, which it initially was not. And can you talk about kind of the difference, how the differences in how the definition changed and how this is damaging to people who are already under assault?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting that there can be one event or we could be in a space of time where these small things at the time can be, you know, catapulted into this new realm of understanding and awareness of the words and the impact that they bring to our daily life. I think at the beginning, woke was used as a positive term, like enlightened and aware, and being in a lens of empathy towards other individuals or equity deserving groups, and understanding what it actually means to be Black or a person of color or someone who's actually identifies as a female. And I think what's so important is that we really revered individuals who took that time to be empathetic and be in those shoes, to understand and to learn and to be humbled and to be even embarrassed or, you know, a bit shy on what their own backgrounds were and how they have played into the narrative of any discrimination from that element. And then when you think about the word woke today, there's a phrase, you know, now kind of circulating the internet and the different platforms of like, you know, get woke, go broke. And we've even seen it recently when we think about, you know, Disney. They have done a lot of strides and a lot of changes to their platform, to their entertainment streams, to be aware that if you're watching, you know, those Disney movies we all grew up loving, there's a disclaimer now that some of these narratives are incorrect. They play on different ideologies that no longer have the same hold in our value system. Or if we think about the new Little Mermaid movie and people being incredibly upset that the new Little Mermaid is a Black girl, like now Disney being very aware and being conscious of the market they serve, of the audience they are trying to now entertain, and now being bashed for it and being shamed for changing this historical element of what was once upon a time, and that to evolve and to change and to update can't happen if it's going to ruin our childhood memories of fictional characters. And we've weaponized this word that used to once be an element of respect and understanding and made it so evil and scary, and really, I think, took us back to a space where we really shouldn't be. And I think we need to really recognize, again, coming back to the theme of our talk, like, words matter. The impact of what we say and the context of which we utilize these words take on a life of their own. And if we don't rein in and really understand the gravity of what we are doing, the implications today and for our future generations are going to be horrific. And we are going to be put in a spot where we are really going to have to self-examine and create a new vocabulary that really will start to truly identify the intentional and the meaning of what we say, to avoid it being twisted and misused for negative and for, disappropriated purposes.
Absolutely.
And
Thank you for that, Allison. Michael, one of the things, those are all profound points, and I want to get you to jump in on them as we talk about power and the impact. I mean, you talked about your son. We talk about the importance that Alicia's bringing up about children and how children will be impacted. You can imagine the Little Mermaid Black girls who are excited. And imagine if you have a 3-year-old girl then seeing some big adult saying, oh, that's like stupid and dumb, etc. Right. I mean, that power then can dash the ideas and the hope of little girls, even for example. So when you think about power, what's your perspective in general? You can speak to Alicia's point or any of the others. What's your perspective?
No, I appreciate it. It's good. I'm actually also thinking about the word woke and that idea, that I do hear it, the sort of negative reaction to this idea that I am observant, that I am trying to offer it, equivalency at some level, equity at some level, as being a bad thing. So when I think about being in a position of power, and I'm not even just saying as a white man or leader in a company, but there's all variations of power and privilege, that, there's some of this is being brave enough not to worry about being, negative being a bad term, right? Or that I'm going to, my focus on this could be perceived as pandering. If done right, it's not, right? I think in a position of privilege, I loved the idea that I don't think about very often, is that even when you're in a position of privilege, maybe before sort of, reacting or leading by an example, to think about where people have privilege above you or at a different capacity. It puts perspective in how you feel, how your work is impacted by the words people use. So just really getting back to a place of power and privilege, I think we have an ability to, or I don't want to say responsibility as much as it's just good leadership, to try to recognize those opportunities and bring them up, in the appropriate context, have uncomfortable conversations that move past that, where we see words headed in the wrong direction. It can be corrected or reacted, and it can be done in a very open, transparent type of dialogue. And I think that's part of maybe what our responsibility as a leader, right? So finding these opportunities to, there's the obvious ones, making sure that we're promoting and giving leadership responsibilities to folks from all different perspectives and walks of life is sort of a maybe not always incredibly visible way to do it, but the other way is just to recognize education opportunities, to recognize opportunities really just to pause and bring up a discussion that doesn't have to be correcting somebody, but driving the conversation into something more inclusive.
And I think also, thank you for that, Michael, asking, because being uncomfortable, asking questions and still being uncomfortable. But I think the key thing, if I in a position of power, like if I were a Michael per se, is when you get pushback or feedback, not to be defensive. Yes. Because if you're defensive, you shut down the person that you're speaking to. So it is important to recognize that. And then as we move on a little bit, Jane, there's a question actually that we're going to address. And the question from the Q&A is like, if this person's working on a spreadsheet, trying to figure out, when do you use she is done, or I will share with the team, or they is more than one person. There's a question out there, and specifically related to that question, we were going to talk about gender identities, right? Which is not a new thing. If you go back in history and read, it's always been here, but it's been a secret that we couldn't talk about. And now things are obviously more fluid and it's become a real part of the cultural lexicon. So can you briefly define some of the key points that are important in this gender identity topic? Explain
thanks.
the words and the definitions, please. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And thanks for this question about pronouns. I think it's also an important one. So I think that key definitions, and if we talk about gender specifically, and what's most confusing, I think, is the difference between sex and gender. You hear both, and maybe they're used interchangeably, maybe not. So there's a lot of confusion around there. So I'd like to say that sex really refers to a set of biological attributes in humans and other animals, of course. And it's primarily associated with some physical and really physiological features that we often think only defined by our sexual anatomy, but actually sex, biological sex, includes other things like chromosomes, gene expression, hormone levels and hormone functions, and of course the reproductive anatomy. But it's more than just one thing by which we actually categorize people in today's society still. And it's usually categorized as female and male, and there is also variation based on those different biological factors. So you might have a certain set of reproductive organs and a different set of chromosomes or a different set of hormones that don't conventionally match. So that's there from the nature, and I like that because many people tell me, well, there are men and there are women, and this is how nature made us. No, nature has a variety in itself as well. So that's sex. And gender really refers to socially constructed roles and behaviors around different sexes. So this is what we expect women or men behave, look like, perceive themselves as, and so on and so forth. And that really influence how we act and interact, and it influences the distribution of power and resources. And it's important to realize that this gender identity, it's not binary and nor is it static. It's really a continuum and can change even every day, or person, for me, it can change multiple times a day depending on who I'm with and which, kind of environment I'm in. So these are two important things to distinguish. One is biological and one is really a social construct and a set of roles and behavior.
Thank you, Jane, for that. I mean, there's so many great questions in the chat, and so that we can, I've been trying to weave them in as we go so that we can get to some of them. Let's sort of wrap up as we are getting to about 10 minutes left. I know how fast things go when you're having a really great conversation, but there's something in the chat I do want to address as you're speaking, Jane. One of the things that I know Nick wanted to talk about was they and them, and she wanted to talk about, she mentioned something about objects and how if someone leaves their phone behind, let's say you're in a meeting room, there's a conference room, and you will say someone left their phone, or they left their phone, or let's go get them to see what's happening. When you think about pronouns, that's a really good way to think about it, and even also having more generic, non-assuming conversations is to speak in that way. If you've ever worked with me, you notice I always say hello, everyone, and hello. And it's important to continue that sort of transformation that says, I don't really know, and it's really none of my business about who they are. My business is to be respectful when I can. And there's another question that asks about how do you deal with people, your boss who's in power, who's always interrupting people of color, marginalized people in a meeting, or people say, they say something that is kind of offensive and they go, I'm just kidding. And one way, I have to say, we always want to try and be safe. So I would encourage, usually we all know someone at work who we feel comfortable with. I would actually go to that person and say, check in and say, this is really bothering me. I want to reach out and approach my boss or my leader. What do you think? Because you know him or her better than I do. How do you think they're going to receive this is number one. And number two, you should have a private conversation saying, this is how you made me feel, not in an accusatory way, just to speak your piece. So it is important to make sure you're safe and then make sure that, you have support from someone who can guide you on having the conversation. And I would say if you're a leader, please be open and stop being in the just kidding mode. All of these words are harmful. They show and mean that you don't care, that you're being insensitive and potentially defensive. So the idea and goal is that we all come together as one. So let's, as panelists, as maybe a final question so we could get to some of the really good questions in the Q&A. We also know that words, as much as we've been talking about the words that are bothering us or might have issues, that they can build the bedrock for new levels of progress, appreciation, and humanity. So if you doubt the power of words, what I want everyone to do is just ask yourself again, if you're tiptoeing around something, you're feeling defensive, then you know you're in that space of learning, right? At the edge of your discomfort is your opportunity to grow. So just know that. So what I want the panelists to finally weigh in on is, how can words build the bedrock for new levels of progress, appreciation, and humanity? Alicia.
I think what we need to recognize is that we create the context and the grounding of the words we say. And so when we want to think about humanity and we want to think about the cultures we want to create and cultivate, it comes down to how are we breathing and truly elevating the words and the narrative we create in these spaces to enable and empower others to do the same. And until we get to a point where we create that opportunity for words to have that impact, we are going to consistently create resistance and create barriers to that true opportunity for connection. So that's how I believe that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Go ahead. Let's hear from you, Jane.
Thanks. Well, I think for words, as they are so important, it's also a very important thing to realize that they actually change and language changes, and we saw it through the course of history. The way we say things change all the time, every day, and it reflects the current state of our society and is really dictated by it. So there's no point in clinging on to how we were saying things in the past and saying, well, but it's always been like that. Why are you trying to change that? Because A, it hasn't. Things were introduced as well. There's things that you're saying today. And no one is trying to change the language. It just follows the concepts that we have as human beings. So as some concepts become obsolete or disappear, words change as well. And this is a completely natural process. And we should be curious about it and embrace it rather than be defensive about it.
Thank you, Jane. Shahed.
I think just adding on to Jane, like we should just approach this with flexibility and agility, and just be receptive and open. Do a basic like risk cost benefit ratio, like the risk, what you lose by referring to someone by how they want to refer, no matter what your beliefs are, no matter what you think or what your political like affiliation is, you stand to gain a profound relationship with this other human being. You stand to gain so much more by just referring to them by how they want to be referred. And it just, I feel like the most humane way to interact with one another. And by not doing that, we gain nothing and we lose everything.
Okay, I think we lost you for a moment there, Shahed. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go to Michael.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I heard you fine, Shahed, but who
Thank
knows? It's always fun being on Zoom. So thinking what I sort of wanted to hit on a little bit is really the reaction and to using words, right? So every day I'm making decisions on who's running a team. I'm making business decisions, and I know that I'm bringing a bias and experience in those decisions, and then in the words that I use to describe it, no matter how I educate myself. So so I know sometimes I will say something, or any person can say something that can hurt the relationship with the team or the person. So a couple things I think are where the one thing I wanted to hit that I sort of haven't hit on is just being empathetic and observing. There's other questions in the chat just about people saying the wrong thing or just saying sorry, or maybe people having traits that you don't see as the way that you don't visibly understand the right words. So mistakes will happen. They'll happen from my experience. They'll happen from what you know. And reacting to those just by, you can watch body language, you can be sensitive to the energy in the room. And there's a lot of ways to react, just changing from that point forward, and then appropriately having conversations with other people who you watch the energy in the room change by what they said at the appropriate time is possible and good, and maybe not comfortable, but important. And I think, not to get us down that whole path, but that's what it means to be an ally in this situation. I was just thinking about what, and then to talk about Mr. Rogers, but he always said, look for the helpers. And so for me, I think that's something that is important for me to try to think of is how do I be that helper? And that's what an ally is for me, is not just saying, I'm willing to say that this is an important thing. I'm willing to say I promote diversity, but I'm willing to maybe have those hard conversations. And in all honesty, most of the time, it's being willing and able to just put your cards on the table and say, oh, wow, that was insensitive. Here's how we should do it better, not just, oh, I'm sorry, and then we do it again 3 weeks.
Right. And Michael, as we're running out of time,
Yep.
You mentioned the word ally, and we won't have time to discuss that, but that's a really important word that I think is overused. And I know some of the panelists believe, like Shahed, that it's overused to the point of inaction. Just being an ally is not saying the word. It is, and oftentimes it means, like many of us who are marginalized, you're standing alone. So being an ally means that you stand up for things that maybe your peers, et cetera, don't agree with, and you have to take the opportunity to teach. And oftentimes, again, have to address this later, a lot of what we're seeing as allyship is being overused and misused, and it's not just signing up, it is actually doing.
Yes.
Okay, and so let's try and take at least 2 questions. We've tried to answer them along the way, but let's take a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll make a point to 1 or 2 and then just throw it out for the team as we wrap up. So there's one point about, for many neurodiverse and neurodivergent people, words certainly matter, and so on, and that this is something that you can't see. Just like actually you can't really see gender diversity if a person is same sex, or they were born, but they born under one gender, but they feel like a different gender. Most of the things you can see are color and the specific gender assignments that were given. So I think that this is why I say we all have diversity to learn. There was another question about color as well. And I think we focus in America too much on color. There's so much more diversity that we have. And I think that all of us have to learn how to be comfortable saying privately, a lot of this stuff isn't public. You privately go to the person and say, can you help me understand? Or I thought this, I'm so sorry. Let me figure out how to do this correctly. So it is about having human dialogue. Were there any things from the panelists that you saw that you want to respond to? We only have 1 minute left, so it would have to be something that you could respond to very quickly.
I'll be very quick, just jumping on what you said. The neurodiverse topic hits home. I've seen other panels, and there's a lot of good content out on YouTube, so go look at it. But one of the things of being an ally in any space, and neurodivergent, an example, is to have that dialogue, to be open to it, to talk through it, to have panels that cover that. I think we've sort of shied away a little bit from that dialogue until recent years. And so, in my past, I've had some crippling anxiety that I've worked through over the years. May not be able to tell that by me sitting on the panel, but that has helped me grow and evolve. So having that discussion, being willing to share it, I think is also about part of being an ally.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you so much to everyone on the panel. And on behalf of our sponsors, BMC, Broadcom Mainframe Software, IBM Open Mainframe Project, Rocket Software, Tech Channel, and Virtual Z, we thank you, Alicia, Shahed, Jane, and Michael, for your candor and participation in this event. And to all of those who have been on the panel, I want you to remember that the limits of your language means that you are limiting your world. Be the same person privately as you are publicly and personally, and that your words, which are internalized, create your behavior, and your behavior is an image of your thinking. So ask yourself as you leave the session today, what word or behavior will you change today, right now, on this topic in terms of making us a great place to be and to accomplish the goals that you believe that you need to accomplish. So thank you all again for joining us. I'm Dr. Gloria Chance. It's been my pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.